Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mobardi. Today is Monday, March 25th, and we have a lot to get into today. We are going to be starting off by recapping the round of 32 in the NCAA tournament that just took place this past weekend. We'll be diving into that and sort of what is to come from here, headed into the Sweet 16. Then we are going to be getting into a little bit of NBA. I know that most of our basketball content as of late has been surrounding college basketball, but we do have a very interesting playoff race taking place at the bottom of the Western Conference, as the Houston Rockets have been playing tremendous basketball while the Warriors have been staggering, and it has tightened up there. Then to end the show, we are going to be running a couple segments on the NFL owners meeting and some things that have come out of it. We're going to be getting into the decisions with the New England Patriots around the quarterback position, whether or not they should draft someone, and what they should do with that number 3 overall pick. So we will do that, as well as some of the rule changes that are taking place that have been approved these past couple days. But before we get into all of that, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us, and for our live viewers to use the comment section, make the show as interactive as possible. The chat's been doing a lot better as of late, trying to make this activity here as engaging as possible. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link gsmcpodcast.net that is scrolling across the bottom ticker. That would be greatly appreciated. Now, getting into our first segment of the day, the round of 32 recap. We're going to try and fly through as much of this as possible in the time that we have. We're going to be going region by region broadly here on the topic of this past weekend. Frankly, it was not the most exciting in terms of the intrigue in the games themselves. In a lot of these, the betting favorites went 15-1 in these set of games, 8 per each weekend day. The only upset was Clemson overtaking Baylor. Not only that, but 11 of the 16 favorites covered the spread, making it a brutal weekend for Vegas, and 11 of the 16 games finished with double-digit wins. So we did have a few great overtime games that really carried the load, but we're going to be starting in the East region and working counterclockwise from there, starting with the East, which was a little bit of the region of blowouts this weekend, where the closest score was Iowa State beating Washington State by 11. We saw UConn demolishing Northwestern. They have reached the Sweet 16 with a combined point differential of 56 points, and that could have even been bigger, considering that they were up by 30 points in the second half of this game at one point, and just a really dominant start from UConn, who we've seen historically the number 1 overall seeds being a little bit lackluster. The Huskies are far from that up to this point in the tournament. They look like the best team in college basketball. They have been the best team in college basketball in a lot of people's eyes for the majority of the regular season, and they have not slowed down yet, looking to repeat as national champions. Speaking of national champions, they will be going on to face San Diego State, who blew out Yale in the last game of the weekend on Sunday night. But this is actually a rematch of that national championship game that took place last season between UConn and San Diego State. So should be interesting there. I do think that San Diego State has flown a little bit under the radar again this year, and coming out of a Mountain West conference that has had a lot of definitely polarizing comments made about it. San Diego State is holding it down for them as they advance to their second consecutive Sweet 16. I mentioned Iowa State's win over Washington State. They advanced to play Illinois. Both Illinois and Iowa State really dominated these matchups. Illinois specifically over Duquesne was tremendous. We already know the level of offense that Illinois plays, but what they're doing on the defensive side as well has been really impressive as they are putting this together. We know about the size that Illinois has, and if they can continue to play the level of defense they become extremely scary in this tournament. But I want to highlight Terrence Shannon Jr., who really shined in this game against Duquesne, scoring 30 points, and now we've seen since the beginning of the Big Ten Conference Tournament, he is averaging 31.6 points per game on 53-42 shooting splits. He has been incredible as of late. That stretches among 5 games. So have to give Terrence Shannon Jr. all the credit in this one, in a class where there isn't a tremendous amount of young talent, as in freshman, sophomore. Terrence Shannon Jr., an older player, has been able to potentially carve out a path for himself to be a lottery pick as a senior. He's not the only one there. Dalton Knecht is also sort of in that category. We will get to him later in this segment as well. But this weekend was pretty boring in the East. We will have some good matchups headed into next round, where 5 seed being the lowest in San Diego State. Again, the reigning runner-ups, I should say, from last year's championship team. They have a lot of their same pieces back, and it's going to be interesting to see. I think it should be a lot of fun. Now moving on to the South. One of the matchups of the weekend with some late game drama last night, Houston versus Texas A&M, where Houston was up 81-69 with a minute 51 left in the game. A&M went on a 17-5 run to close out regulation, and they ended up hitting a buzzer beater off an inbounds pass to send the game to overtime. This really did become very interesting, with Houston losing a handful of players to foul trouble in this one. It helped open up the door for A&M to come back. 4 starters fouling out, including Houston's 3 best players in this game in Jamal Shed, LJ Cryer, and Emmanuel Sharp. Sharp led the Cougars in this game with 30 points. I also thought, though, that Jamal Shed continues to show that he is one of the best players in college basketball across the country, where he was just incredibly impactful, initiating the offense for the Cougars in this one, where he was getting to the free throw line himself, he was setting up his teammates, and we obviously know the level of defense that he plays from the guard position, which was really impactful. But sort of in the similar light to Houston getting themselves into foul trouble, honestly, this was not their best game, and credit to A&M, who I thought was going to be a tough matchup in this one. We know about their offensive rebounding, the best offensive rebounding team in the country this past season, and how physical they play. But that is sort of what led to Houston getting in trouble here, where they are typically the team that sort of assorts their physical will on other teams more, but they allowed 26 offensive rebounds. They put A&M at the free throw line 45 times, and really, if A&M had gotten a productive game from Wade Taylor, who had some big-time scoring outbursts down the stretch of the season, or if they hit their free throws, this definitely could have gone in the favor of A&M, but instead Houston is moving on to play Duke, who rolled James Madison University on Sunday. Quickly on that game, big takeaway is freshman guard Jared McCain for Duke being phenomenal. He scored 30 points on 10 of 15 shooting, 8 of 11 from 3. The second most points in Duke history by a freshman in an NCAA tournament game. just behind Zion, who did so in 2019 with 32 points, is the record for them. McCain is positioning himself to be a potential lottery pick in the upcoming draft, as he's had, specifically on offense, a very nice outing down the stretch of this season. Duke versus Houston should be cinema. We also had NC State come out on top in an overtime game against Oakland. The battle of the two March Madness sweethearts in Jack Golke and DJ Burns. It's funny how this 11th seeded NC State team that was on their own little bit of an incredible run in the ACC tournament, winning the 5 games in 5 days and earning their spot into the tournament, they become the villains almost because of the fact that they were facing the biggest potential Cinderella story in Oakland. But DJ Burns, the big man, came out on top with another incredible performance. 24 points, which led the team in scoring, 11 rebounds and 4 assists. It was scary for the Wolfpack a little bit in that one, where they lost Muhammad Diarra and Ben Middlebrooks, who had been so key for them in the first round. Diarra was having a nice game for himself in this one as well, but just the creation of DJ Burns, both for himself and for others, where he draws these double teams because of the force he is on the inside and being a very solid passer out of double teams. If he isn't double teamed, he is more than happy to take it himself. He helped spark a 9-0 run in overtime and close out Oakland, which does mark the end of the run for the Golden Grizzlies. I know that a lot of people are almost just lame in the discrediting what Oakland did. I know that they only won 1 game, but this is what March is all about, is these little stories. Ultimately, we never really see these mid-major Cinderellas last all too long, but it was incredibly fun while it lasted. Golke had 22 points in this game, and the shot chart doesn't look great for him. He was 6 of 17, and the efficiency, again, wasn't necessarily there, but he also was sort of forced to chuck up some shots at the end that sort of hurt the shot percentage. But crazy how he just emerged, and he was absolutely swarmed off ball, both in this game but also going back to Kentucky as well. Out of all of the 16 threes that he hit in his 2 games, maybe 2 of them were wide open. All of them seemed to be fading away, coming off of the screen, sprinting out, and it was a ton of fun to watch. But you have to give credit to Trey Townsend, who sort of went under the radar, at least in terms of the tournament performances, where he was the Golden Grizzlies' leading scorer this season, and he finished this game versus NC State with 30 points and 13 rebounds. And with Golke being harassed so much on the perimeter, he did all the heavy lifting in terms of creation. We saw NC State come away with this one. Every starter finished with at least 11 points, and they will need a similar team effort to try and knock off Marquette next round, who Marquette offensively really is firing. Lots of turnovers in this game by both teams, which if you are Marquette, definitely want to see those numbers go down. But it was a very fun game where Tyler Kolek did lead the way for Marquette with 21 points and 11 assists. He scored or assisted on every point in the final 8 minutes of the game, other than David Joplin's free throws at the very end of regulation. But he did contribute a lot to the turnover numbers. He had 6 himself, but ultimately it was him operating the Golden Eagles offense that led them to this win. It is important to have him really coming back into full health, where he missed a handful of games at the end of the regular season, as well as the Big East tournament, where he was dealing with an oblique injury, and he had missed 6 games headed into the round of 64, but he's back, he seems healthy, and he is a real contributor for this Marquette team. Cam Jones as well, want to give him his flowers a little bit. He's off to a very hot start in the tournament as well. 28 versus Western Kentucky, and now another 18 versus Colorado. He's been very efficient and very important for them as head coach Shaka Smart finally returns to the Sweet 16, first time since 2011, which is crazy to me that it has been this long. But Marquette is a legitimate program, and they have the pieces to make a run here. As we talked about, they'll face NC State, which they open as 6.5-point favorites headed into that matchup later this week. Midwest here, Purdue and Gonzaga both dominated their ways to a matchup in the Sweet 16. Purdue put up 106 points versus Utah State. Edey has scored 53 points, grabbed 35 rebounds, and blocked 6 shots in his first 2 games of the tournament. And Purdue has escaped being upset by a mid-major school to pretty much preserve their integrity, where after the past few seasons and the disappointing exits, they couldn't really afford losing again to a bad team, especially with Edey on his way into the NBA draft following this season. But now the road ahead of them, not that it's easy and they still have a lot to prove, but they don't have the chance to lose to a bad team. It's all good teams from here, as we have one of the more talented overall Sweet 16 pools that we've had in a handful of years. And they will be playing Gonzaga next, who they played earlier this year in Maui during the Invitational there. Interesting, if you look back at Purdue, who won the Invitational, they went through Gonzaga, Tennessee, and Marquette in the next 2 rounds. Gonzaga, Tennessee, Marquette in those rounds. There's a real possibility that could be the same path that they have to take to get to the national championship game moving forward here, but they can't necessarily look ahead all too much just yet. Shout out my friend Andrew Shen, big time basketball head. He sort of filled me in on that. Wanted to give him some credit because that was a good spot. Now, that all happened in November, so we are obviously far removed from that. Can't necessarily look at the results too much, but just notable that they have seen each other and have likely put together a game plan for one another. Nothing should necessarily catch them all too much by surprise in this one. I guess if anything were to, would be the development of Graham Ike during the second half of the year. But again, for the most part, these are familiar programs for sure. Now, Gonzaga on the other end, they were trailing by 1 to Kansas at halftime, and they ended up outscoring them by 22 in the second half, ultimately a blowout win. Gonzaga was the lower seed, but they were 3.5-point favorites headed into this game. Kansas, without Kevin McCullough Jr. and the issues they've had off of the bench all season, just did not have the legs to keep up, and it showed in that second half. Gonzaga abused Hunter Dickinson and company in the pick and roll game in this one, helped them shoot 60% from the field, and their starters were 29 of 45, which is just over 64% from the field. So an incredible showing from the Bulldogs in this one, and this should be another really intriguing matchup on Friday. Probably the game of the weekend was Oregon versus Creighton, where it was a rematch between Oregon head coach Dana Altman and his former team in Creighton, where he spent over a decade with some time ago. The matchup of the two winningest coaches in Creighton history with Altman and Greg McDermott. And this ended up going into double overtime. The final score was not indicative of the game itself, where Creighton wins 86-73, but this was incredibly entertaining down the stretch, and Oregon really, to stay alive in this one, was just riding its 2 stars in Nafali Dante and Jermaine Couisnard through the second half and into the first overtime period. It was all them. No other player scored for them. and they just didn't have the legs to keep up as the game progressed and they got into the second overtime period. The Blue Jays were just too well-rounded, and Creighton ended up dominating that final period. Heavy minutes for the Blue Jays stars, and Baylor Shireman and Trey Alexander playing all 50 minutes in this one. Ryan Kalkbrenner played all but one. Now, this also had Stephen Ashworth as well contributing for them. He led them in scoring, and all four of them had at least 18 points. Cool to see the development of these guys all together. They've had a handful of them for some years now, Kalkbrenner really being the centerpiece of that. And now they're headed to their third Sweet 16 in 4 years now. They will be facing Tennessee. Massive props to Nafali Dante and Jermaine Couisnard, combined for the first 32 points, as I mentioned, from the second half into the first overtime period. Couisnard scored 32 on Saturday, following up on his 40-point performance in their win over Florida in the first game. The lack of production from anyone else was really their downfall in this one. Tennessee, in the same bracket, they controlled the game for the majority, but Texas did make it interesting late. But I thought this was a very impressive win for Tennessee, where Dalton Knecht, the reigning SEC Player of the Year, struggled offensively. In this one, he only had 4 points at halftime. He did end up finishing with 18, but he was just 5 of 18 from the field, 1 of 8 from 3. And the team as a whole was really struggling from the three-point line. Just 3 of 25, the lowest made threes on 25 or more attempts in a win in NCAA tournament history. The team has benefited from having a scorer at the level of Knecht this season, but under Rick Barnes, their identity has often been leaning on the defense, and we see that they can win in multiple ways. They are 10-1 this season when hitting less than 8 3-pointers, according to CBS, which is a pretty impressive stat. Now, final region quickly here is the West. Not very many compelling games in this one either. Big story was Clemson being the one underdog to win their game this weekend. A well-rounded attack for Clemson led by Chase Hunter. They led just about the whole way. Baylor tried to make a push late in the game, and I almost think if you just watched the last few minutes, probably should have won this one. I'm also a little bit biased. I just really enjoyed watching Baylor this season, and I was disappointed to see them out. But I also enjoyed Clemson a lot this year. I thought that their season ended in a little bit of a risky way, where they dropped some games to Wake Forest and then got blown out by BC in their first game of the ACC tournament. But here they are in the Sweet 16, and an unfortunate ending for Baylor. Jacoby Walter, and Baylor as a team as a whole, but Walter specifically struggled from the free throw line late in this one. I believe he missed 5 of his last 6 attempts. He was pretty good otherwise. I know that the overall shot chart, again, is a situation where it wasn't tremendous, but I thought that Walter showed a lot of good in this matchup. Ray J. Dennis dropped 27 points in the loss as well, but really impressive for Clemson to come away with this one with their leading scorer, PJ Hall, dealing with foul trouble all game, only played 19 minutes, and they were able to come away with it. UNC, Alabama, Arizona all cruised to wins over their opponents in this region as well. So the matchups are going to be UNC versus Bama and Arizona versus Clemson. This marks the 5th time that all the number 1 and number 2 seeds have made it to the Sweet 16 since 1979. We'll be getting more into the Sweet 16 as the week progresses here, but this did most recently happen in 2019, where we had some great Sweet 16 matchups. So if you want to go and check that bracket out, you can have a little bit of a reference for how it's played out in the past. But we will, as I mentioned, get more into those matchups as the week progresses. For now, we are going to be taking our first break, and when we come back on the other side, we will be getting into some NBA and the Western Conference playoff race. So stick with us. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some motion shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just wrapped up the round of 32, and I think, all things considered, a pretty efficient way, but now we are going to be getting into some NBA as we have the Rockets surging themselves into playoff contention. It seemed like they were dead in the water after an encouraging start to begin the season. I was on the record saying that they were one of my more fun teams to watch on League Pass, as they're young, they're hungry. Ime Udoka, even though the Celtics fan in me has a little bit of resentment for how things played out there, I believe he's an incredible coach and he gets his guys to play really hard, and we've seen them playing with an edge over the course of the past month or so, really all season as a whole. But the issue with them, especially early in the year, was the inability to win on the road. They definitely showed some of their youth with that. And, you know, they brought in a little, you can say, more veteran guys in Fred VanVleet and Dillon Brooks this past offseason, but I definitely wouldn't consider Dillon Brooks to be, you know, a fully mature veteran up to this point, as well as I do think he has been playing specifically as a defender. But they ended up falling to 25-34 entering March. Since then, they have gone 10-1 to get back to 500, and they now sit just one game behind the Warriors, who during that same stretch at the end of March to now have gone 7-12. So again, one game back for the Rockets from the 10 spot, the final play-in spot, and we are just under 3 weeks away from the last regular season games of the season. And so I wanted to sort of dive into Houston a little bit here, who has been a very interesting case since the beginning of March, where, like I mentioned, they are on a nice winning streak. Currently, I believe it is 8 straight games. And what's a little bit even more so impressive is the fact that they have done so without the help of star center Alperen Şengün, who Şengün has really emerged as one of the top young pieces in the league as a whole, really, but has been an incredible player and probably the number one asset for the Rockets, despite having multiple top 3 picks the past couple years as well. But he has been the main catalyst for them, and yet they are on this win streak. They've won 6 straight games without him. He went down late versus the Sacramento Kings, where it was ruled a grade 3 ankle sprain, and which is nothing too major, but it was initially reported that he would be out for the rest of the season. Now the Rockets are still in contention here, so maybe he could make a return, but what version are we getting of him in terms of overall health? That is still definitely a big time question to consider. But either way, what we have seen definitively since Şengün has left is Jalen Green elevating his play to another level. He's averaging 31.7 rebounds and 3.5 assists on 53-48 shooting splits in these 6 games without Şengün here. Only one team out of the recent set of games is in the top half of the league in defensive rating. The Cavs, who are missing Evan Mobley in that matchup as well. So do with that what you may. But Houston is playing some really good basketball right now, led by Jalen Green, who was, of course, the number 2 overall pick just a few years ago. The Rockets are second in the league in offensive rating and second in the league in net rating in the past 6 games since Şengün has gone down. So they haven't dipped. It's not just an anti-Şengün thing here, because in the past 11 games, they're also still second in offensive rating and third in net rating. And it is a lot due to the way that Jalen Green has been able to conduct the offense, who I can't say I've been the number 1 fan of through his career, but I always defended him because of the fact that people were trying to throw him out as a bust just a couple years into his career, which I personally thought was ridiculous, because we've seen the flashes of him. Yes, the inconsistency sometimes can be very concerning, and I understand that, and the efficiency as well, in terms of, and this is something that I sort of talked about with Nelson, the host of the GSMC Basketball Podcast, also on our network here. Feel free to check him out. I joined him on Friday to talk a couple things, including the G League Ignite shutting down, which Jalen Green is, of course, an alumni of. He was drafted 2nd overall after playing for the Ignite, and really, we talked about the fact that it's not the best place for development with a lot of these young stars. There's not necessarily a team first atmosphere. It's a lot of just trying to make sure that you get yours in order to become the best possible draft prospect. And then Jalen Green came into an entirely rebuilding Houston Rockets organization that was dealing with the surprise departure really, of James Harden. Steven Silas, a young head coach, a rookie head coach, and hadn't really found his way in the league yet either. So it wasn't necessarily the best of situations for Jalen Green. And, we had seen flashes. And just for a number 2 overall pick just a couple years ago in 2021, I wasn't ready to fully turn the page on him, because the talent is clearly there. Now, can he become a winning player? That's still to be seen a little bit, but people were calling him a bust earlier this year. I could never get behind that. I also feel like maybe sometimes I hold out a little bit too long on certain players, but the talent with Jalen Green was way too glaring to officially turn the page on him. And supposedly the Rockets, there was just a report that came out within the past 24 hours. I'm sorry, I don't have the source right on me, but there was a rumor that the Rockets offered Jalen Green and multiple picks in exchange for Mikal Bridges of the Brooklyn Nets, which would have been very interesting to see. I mean, you want to talk about, in not the least critical way possible, but some selfish basketball, would be Jalen Green and Cam Thomas as a backcourt playing together. I can't imagine how that would have worked out necessarily, because Cam Thomas is having a nice season as well. I don't want to be very anti-Cam Thomas, but there are times where I really just question whether or not he can fit in a team environment. But either way here, that was ultimately rejected, and I'm sure the Rockets are happy they held on at this point, where he just turned 22 years old, and there is still plenty of time for him to emerge. Now, he doesn't necessarily have the playmaking abilities that would take him to, point guard levels, but I do feel like oftentimes we see that it takes a little bit more time with certain guards to develop, and sometimes that's just the reality of the situation. We're seeing Jalen Green now developing, and again, I don't want to get carried away by this stretch. We got to see it over a longer span before we can really go franchise cornerstone level with him, but I think he has the physical tools for it. I think he has the skills for it. Now there's a head coach there in Ime Udoka, who granted, not sure totally how he feels about him. If he was totally sold on Jalen Green, then I'm sure there would have been some level of probably rejecting this reported trade offer of him to the Nets. But ultimately, the Rockets are building something here. They also have Jabari Smith Jr., who is getting some very intriguing experience now, starting at the 5 while Alperen Şengün has missed time. He hasn't been incredible during this stretch, but there is a conceivable world where he could turn himself into a stretch 5. I don't think that that is the primary objective here, but he's 6'11", and he definitely has the shooting. He has the size to play it. He's a good defender. He's a very nice perimeter defender. So if you want to talk about switchability, playing 1 through 5, Smith would be an incredible option, I feel like, to run there. Ultimately, I'd rather have him playing the 4 next to Şengün, but it also gives them maybe a little bit of lineup variety and versatility as they continue to build this thing forward. So I just find that interesting as well. Now, this is with the Rockets. Last thing I'll say on them is I do still feel the road games still really scare me. They are 10-24 on the road. Again, this youth, they're made up of a lot of youth. I know I mentioned Van Vliet and Brooks, but neither one of them have necessarily been able to overall help the Rockets solve this issue of being a young, inexperienced team and not necessarily being able to win consistently on the road. Now, if you look at this win streak for them, you do have to give them credit for a handful of these games. Now, it's not like they have played a ton of, difficult competition, but they knocked off the Suns at home, they knocked off the Suns while they were on the road to kick off March, and then they also have a couple wins over the Kings, or they have one win against the Kings on the road and a win against the Cavaliers as well. Again, it's not necessarily like the level of competition has been extremely high for them, but they are a very intriguing team to me. Now, quickly to wrap this up on the Warriors end of this, like I said, in the same stretch where the Rockets have gone 10-1, the Warriors have been 7-12, and they have been staggering. 7-12 almost sounds wrong. I'll have to double check myself on that stat specifically, but one way or another, they are just a game ahead of the Rockets, and they're dealing with some injuries to Steph Curry, where he is on minutes restrictions. Last night, they lost to the Minnesota Timberwolves in a close game that had a lot of people upset with Steve Kerr for some of the minutes management and not playing Curry more down the stretch. It led him to giving a quote about how they've been riding on the back of Steph Curry for too long and that they need other people to step up for them as well. And Curry, of course, suffered an ankle injury about a month or so ago, a few weeks ago, against the Chicago Bulls late in that one. But Kerr said that we can't expect to just ride Steph game after game after game. We've put the burden on this franchise on his shoulders for 15 years. We can't expect him to play 35 minutes. He went on to say, if you want to say that him playing 30 minutes instead of 32 is a difference between a win and a loss, I totally disagree with that. We're trying to win the game, and we're trying to keep him fresh too. So it is interesting sort of how they are going to choose to balance this, considering the fact that they are now in this close race Now, they've gotten some players to sort of turn around. They've gotten Chris Paul healthy. Klay Thompson seems more comfortable in his role off of the bench. But either way, not a great position here for the Warriors, who are one of the most expensive payrolls in the league and are just 2 games over 500 and could see themselves on the outside of the play-in tournament, let alone the playoffs itself. So has been a pretty discouraging season for the Warriors here. Not that it's impossible for them to at least turn their act around some at the end of the regular season, but their contention hopes are just about non-existent. I know it's hard to fully turn the page on a team that has that same nucleus, but at the same time, I just don't see it with them. I have a hard time believing that they can even go into LA and knock off the Lakers in a win-or-go-home situation. But let me know how you guys feel about that same topic in the comment section. Now we are going to be taking another break, and when we come back, we will be getting into the NFL owners meetings and starting with the conversation about the New England Patriots and what their future looks like. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're getting into our third segment of the day, where we will be talking some NFL. The NFL Owners Weekend, Owners Meeting is actively going on. All the coaches and owners are meeting in Orlando, Florida, to review some rules. There's a lot of media sessions where they are talking to reporters, and I wanted to get into a situation with the Patriots, as they have a lot of unknowns still going into next year. I believe that the franchise is at a little bit of a crossroads now. They have fired Bill Belichick. Robert Kraft just put out this Apple TV documentary, The Dynasty. I'm going to do my full review at some time soon, but I'm only about halfway through. The perception of it is very negative on Bill Belichick, sort of paints him as the villain more so than actually propping up the accomplishments. And it's interesting with Kraft, where he is almost now, after what should be a celebration of the dynasty, and granted, I know that a lot of non-Patriots fans want to see some of the dirtier stuff with it. He sort of wipes his hands clean of anything himself, and really just for the past few seasons, he has pretty much tried to make it as clear as possible that he is not to blame for the demise of the Patriots. And while I do think that Bill Belichick, the general manager, was very poorly mismanaging the situation the past few seasons, you also go back a decade and the Patriots have been one of the lowest spending teams in the NFL, and I do believe that that somewhat falls on Robert Kraft. They went out and they spent in that one-off season, believe it was heading into the 2021 season, when they brought in the likes of Hunter Henry, Jonnu Smith, and others, that was supposed to really rejuvenate them, and it has not been the case since then. And I feel like the franchise now, they hit lows last season with how poorly executed they were, with Bill Belichick going out in a very, not to him specifically, but overall, the game versus the Jets in Week 18 was pathetic for both franchises, and Belichick loses that streak that had gone on for seasons in terms of consecutive wins against the Jets, and they flamed out. But now they bring in Gerard Mayo as their next head coach, and he has sort of gone back and forth with the media in terms of certain things. I feel like when he first got there, he was really excited to show that he's going to be more open with the media, as opposed to Belichick, who was, of course, closed off. But he hasn't been super clear, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, because it would be foolish to fully show your hand. But specifically around the quarterback position, it is interesting where we have seen them at times, or we've seen Mayo specifically answering questions at time saying we're looking for a premier position with the number 3 overall spot, which was sort of insinuating that it was going to be a quarterback. That was very soon after he was announced as the next head coach. Now he's sort of bounced back and forth. He gave a quote earlier this weekend saying, honestly, look, he could, in reference to Jacoby Brissett, he said he could absolutely be our starter next year. We're not dead set at taking a quarterback at number 3, but we do feel good having a guy like Jacoby ready to go, which I don't fully disagree with. That I do feel like Jacoby Brissett could be a solid option as a bridge guy. Is it going to be exciting? Not necessarily, but I do feel like he's almost been a little bit... Now, when I say underrated for a quarterback, obviously keep in mind that there are only 32 starting quarterbacks in the NFL. You can be underrated and you can still not be a starting quarterback. I feel like Brissett sort of falls into that category somewhat, where he won't lose you games, and especially when you have a defense as good as the Patriots were last season, that they can sort of just rely on him to not make the mistakes. And the quarterback play that they got last year was Mac Jones and Bailey Zappi hurting the defense from winning games. Brissett is going to be an improvement from that, but is that enough to necessarily excite the fan base? And he also sort of spoke on that during this weekend, where he gave a quote in response to a question about the frustrated Patriots fans, saying, we're trying to build this the right way. Went on to say, I would just ask Patriots fans for patience. Just sit back and let us do our jobs moving forward. I have talked about this with other teams in the NFL as well, such as the Cowboys. I don't agree in making panic free agent moves or anything along those lines, because of some of the contracts you dish out end up being bad contracts moving forward. But the Patriots have really added just about nothing. They added Taki to the linebacker group, which is fine, but ultimately it was more so just retaining the guys that they already have on their roster, that I do agree that these are the players that they should have looked to keep. But again, nothing that necessarily excites the fan base, for however important you believe that that is. But he also said the Patriots are in the trade market for a wide receiver. Maybe that includes T. Higgins. Maybe it's someone else. That is still to be sought out. Justin Jefferson would be an incredible pickup. I would imagine that it would cost way more than the Patriots, who are still far from contention, would be willing to pay in this situation. But I believe with the number 3 overall pick, specifically, I would love to see them go with Drake May. Jaden Daniels, I've sort of alluded to this. I could talk myself into Jaden Daniels if they drafted him, because he is very exciting play style wise and would be something that the Patriots haven't had pretty much ever in terms of the specific skill set at the quarterback position. But I do sort of have some red flags with Jaden Daniels, and I feel like Drake May would be a great fit for the Patriots. I also feel like a lot of people, their biggest concern with him is some inconsistencies. Now, I also felt like the situation there at UNC wasn't tremendous, but I would also be happy with the Patriots going and drafting a quarterback. I don't feel the need to rush him in behind a bad offensive line and with some subpar receiver options if that's the route they wanted to go. I personally believe that it's typically more valuable to get the hands-on experience than anything else. But if you look at the way that the Patriots had just demolished the confidence and ability of Mac Jones through his first 3 seasons, I definitely think that there is some hesitation for just saying, getting him on the field is the most important thing. It is very important experience, but at the same time, they are going to need to actually put a roster around him that is going to be successful. And you can't really afford fumbling a quarterback prospect as bad as they did with Mac Jones, because I will stand behind the fact that he wasn't a total disaster during his rookie season. He was a Pro Bowler. They did win 10 games and make the playoffs. Now, it obviously doesn't fully come down to Mac Jones in this scenario, but I also think that it is really difficult to imagine with all the holes. Again, that offensive line was just dreadful last season, and we saw Mac Jones seeing ghosts on the field where the second he sensed any sort of pressure, he panicked and would make bad throws, would make bad decisions, all of the above. So really difficult to weigh the options here. Kirito, I will address your Warriors comment any moment, but it is interesting talking about that. So I'll get to that just after wrapping up thoughts here on the Patriots and what they should be doing here. Ultimately, if the Patriots decide that Jacoby Brissett is a good enough option for them, that they have so many holes that they need to fill on offense, and they can get, I feel like a trade offer has to start with at least 3 first-round picks for the Patriots in this scenario, where we saw that was about the price that it took for the 49ers to trade up with the Dolphins for the 3rd overall pick in 2021 when they took Trey Lance. You can't just sell off for nothing because you feel like you need some extra draft capital. There needs to be some real conviction, because a lot of times in the NFL, it is, as much as we want to evaluate these quarterbacks and make sure that you get the pick right, a lot of the time it's just swinging and missing on a quarterback until you end up with the one. You can ask the Jaguars that, who, granted, to be fair, Trevor Lawrence still isn't a surefire thing, although I do believe in him long term. And it is just a situation here where the Patriots haven't had draft capital this high in years. Maybe it's worth trading back, but what you definitely can't do in my eyes is go for a receiver, offensive tackle, even, and stay at number 3. Although I do think that those are massive needs, I feel like you can find at least similar play later in this draft where they're deep in both positions there. And ultimately, I think that they need to try and find a way to just set up a young piece for the future. I understand that you want to make sure that you hit on these picks, but you can't play it safe necessarily. And as the Patriots head into this next version of themselves, they can't come out here conservative. If you miss, you miss, but at the same time, they have a lot of work to do. Kirito just commented, in my opinion, there are just some teams in NFL history that can't do rookie quarterbacks. If you can never develop a quarterback, stop trying to build a solid roster, and all you need is a game manager. I think that that is fair. You see certain organizations that are really set up to be a quarterback-friendly system. I feel like you see that with San Francisco, and you see that with Miami, both of which are teams that in the 21st century haven't really had that top-end quarterback talent. And now under their new coaches, all coming from the same tree, of course, but between Kyle Shanahan and Mike McDaniel, they have been able to add tons of talent around the quarterback position and be able to develop the team as a whole in a way that has been really productive, where sure, you're still going to have people doubting Brock Purdy in terms of whether or not he would have success outside of the system. But the reality is, for the 49ers, they're trying to win a championship as soon as possible. And Purdy is good enough, and whether he would he succeed in another situation, he's still being able to make it to the NFC Championship with the 49ers and have the level of success that they are while he's on this extremely cheap deal under $1 million. Obviously, that's not something that you can bank on, is being able to have that level of quarterback play. And clearly, Purdy deserves to be paid based off of his skill more than $1 million. But one way or another, it was a terrific situation to put him into and allow him to develop that way, as opposed to what we just saw with Mac Jones, where it seemed like the team almost devolved in his years there, specifically with the offensive line, with the team refusing to address the fact that last year they didn't draft an offensive player in the first 4 or 5 rounds, other than they ended up taking a guard. It was C.D. So, I believe, was the first offensive player that they drafted last year. Belichick was almost managing the situation petty, and Mac Jones was so upset about the coaching situation on the offensive side with Matt Patricia in 2022. He almost, Belichick that is, went on strike saying, fine, you don't have Matt Patricia anymore. Now you should be fine with whatever else, since it was all his fault. Kirito says Bears should build the defense and offensive line and running back before, and then get a game manager quarterback. It'd be way better off if they did that and not keep drafting quarterbacks first overall. Well, to some degree, I understand you need to build up the roster, but for them, I feel like they're at a crossroads here, where this is now the second consecutive year they have the number 1 overall draft pick, and it's really difficult to pass up on. I know what you're saying, you have to build up the roster as a whole, but to a certain level in the NFL, it's about having the quarterback. And Caleb Williams, I'm not saying I'm 100% sold on him, but they have a chance to reset their quarterback clock here, and they don't really have any other plans otherwise at the position. So yes, they could get a ransom for that first overall pick for Caleb Williams, but I do feel like they've already built up their system to a certain level, to the point where this is just about as good of a position that a number 1 overall pick could fall into. Last week, we dove into all of the positions that, all of the team situations that number 1 overall quarterbacks fell into during their drafts. And I do think that since at least 2010, I'll have to go even further back in the history as I continue to sort of take a look at this, but I think it's about the best possible situation with DJ Moore and Keenan Allen on the perimeter. I think that Cole Kmet is a very solid tight end option to have, especially in the red zone. Offensive line is fine. Would still maybe like to see it a little better, but their defense also took some strides as well last year. So I do feel like now is the time where they can kind of afford to swing at a quarterback during this draft. The NFC North, besides the Lions, are not QB friendly. Yeah, that is a good point, because of snow. And that is a conversation when it comes to Caleb Williams, who's been this California kid as he was coming up, and now he's going to be playing in the ice-cold Chicago. It is a real factor, and it's something that ultimately, if he fails because of that, then I think that it means the evaluation of him was wrong, because ultimately every quarterback is going to have to play in a cold environment. We saw last year with Tua Tagovailoa go into Kansas City, freezing cold in that one, and he struggled to perform. Now, the Dolphins, I don't think they ever really stood a chance against the Chiefs the way that they had as many injuries as they did on the defensive side of the ball. The Chiefs' defense was as elite as they were, so maybe it's an unfair situation here, but you can't be scared necessarily to draft a quarterback because of the cold weather. It's something that you can absolutely consider, but eventually Caleb Williams, whether it's with the Bears or any other franchise in the league, is going to have to play in a cold environment. And you're right, as you say, Josh Allen, he went to Wyoming and he was a little more accustomed to playing in cold weather at the time, and it absolutely has helped him coming into a situation in Buffalo where we know how cold it gets there. But it's hard to sort of navigate all of that because, again, maybe Caleb Williams coming up in the NFL with a little bit more of that cold weather, he can become more acclimated. If not, is he ever going to be able to play in the cold? And you can limit the number of cold games that you play if you were to stay in California. But ultimately, I think you can only run away from the weather for so long, which makes it an interesting conversation. But we're going to be taking our final break of the show. When we come back, we're going to be sticking with the NFL and getting into some of the rule changes that has taken place during the NFL owners meetings. So stick with us and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're headed into our final segment of the day. We've been talking some NFL. Kirito is giving us his insight on some of the NFL quarterback prospect and development factors that come into play. The weather point is a very strong one in terms of necessarily the fit with Caleb Williams with the Bears, which is very interesting. But we are going to be talking some NFL rule changes that have been being thrown around during these owner meetings. We have a couple of different rules that have officially been passed. The biggest one so far is the fact that the NFL is banning the hip drop tackle, which does not come as too much of a surprise to me. For those of you who aren't necessarily aware of what a hip drop tackle is, it's essentially if you are coming from the side of a ball carrier or from behind as a defender, and it's wrapping them up and essentially just throwing all of your weight backwards and falling onto the player's leg. It's been a conversation for a couple years. It really started picking up traction, the idea of banning this type of play, when Mark Andrews got hurt in week 11 when the Ravens played the Bengals on primetime football. Ravens at the time were seen to be just about they were probably the betting Super Bowl favorites of that point, and losing their number one option on offense helped to spark this conversation. But I do see the argument for both sides. On one hand, player safety should be a priority in the NFL. Football is obviously a dangerous sport, though. It is just about impossible to fully remove injuries from any sport, let alone one as violent as football is. And no matter how hard the NFL tries, they're never going to be able to fully remove injuries. And that being said, we saw last year what happened with a lot of these quarterbacks, and the fact that so many of them went down that a record number of quarterbacks were starting the season as a whole, and ultimately it did lead to a decrease in some of the quality of a lot of these football games. and we want to make sure that we protect them, but this could come with other implications. I'm curious what it would mean for the increased injury rate to defenders, if possible, with all of these different restrictions on how they're allowed to tackle a ball carrier. It can become a very difficult situation here. Jonathan Jones of CBS has been reporting from this meeting, and he tweeted an interesting stat where there were 230 instances of the hip drop tackle this past season. 15 times the ball carrier missed time due to an injury from the play. So it's just 6% of the plays. Not tremendously high, but I also don't at this moment have the information necessarily on how long these players were out. And Karatel, I fully agree with your comment in terms of Kareem Jackson. Kareem Jackson is a defensive back in the NFL, and he has been targeted as this dirty player, but it almost goes back to sort of some of the conversations that, and I know Patriots fan here, but I'm not trying to, get on that too much, but Tom Brady has talked about some of the consequences of allowing all of these different rules to sort of stack up in favor of the offense, that it almost makes it the job easier for the quarterback, that they don't have to be as cautious when making throws to players. Kareem Jackson, I feel like there were a couple times in the past couple seasons where he's just making a football play, and ultimately, he gets tagged for defenseless or anything or along those lines. I don't think that's necessarily fair. A lot of these times he's a hard-hitting safety, and that's something that, I believe he specifically referenced it, but if it wasn't him, it was maybe somebody in a similar comment. But imagine Ed Reed, or specifically Ed Reed, obviously one of the hardest hitters of all time, or Troy Polamalu playing in today's game. They wouldn't be the level of, Hall of Fame caliber players, because they'd be spending so much time getting fined and suspended for these big time hits. And it's very difficult, because again, making sure that the best players possible are staying safe and that they're not getting hit with all these long-term injuries, we need to preserve that. But at the same time, there is just a level of, what else are you supposed to do? Sean Taylor is a great example too. Landon Collins as well. All of these players are, some of the big time, most fun hitting safeties. If you go on YouTube and you were to look up, best hits of all time, a lot of them are ruled clean at the time. They just wouldn't survive in today's era. And, I understand the safety argument, but I do also wonder about how this can affect some of the defenders in terms of what they are allowed to do. Nobody that is, very strongly arguing for some of these moves has ever had to go and tackle the likes of a Rob Gronkowski, for example, or these massive players that, sort of changed the way that the game was officiated. Players used to go low on the likes of a Gronk, and ultimately we've just banned so much different ways to play defense that I do feel like maybe we see things swing the other way in terms of defenders being at risk for injuries as well. But there's no denying this play has resulted, the hip drop that is, has resulted in some devastating injuries at times. But at the same time, again, 6% of, these specific plays and how often it happens, 230 instances on the year is about once a game. So it's not like it's the most uncommon thing, but I also feel like it doesn't necessarily fully restrict a ball carrier's season, and Jonathan Jones has been all over this subject. You can go check out his Twitter. I believe I'll find it by the time we get off here. I believe it's like JJones9, something along those lines. But he's been doing a really good... Yeah, it's JJones9 on Twitter if you want to sort of keep up with some of his coverage. He's been helping me a lot with some of this. But he said that it's unlikely that this play is going to be flagged this season. Or it won't be flagged often is what he said. And I'm curious what that means, whether they will give defenders a warning, or ultimately I think it's going to come down to fines. Again, we'll see what this fully means as the season plays out, but it is a very interesting conversation, as we also got reports leading into this where the NFL was supposedly worried about the dip in scoring the past couple seasons. Myself personally, I don't mind watching good defense. I think that it's such an underrated, awesome aspect of football, is the way we see these offensive spikes and then defenses adjust and make things harder. It's this constant chess match that goes on between offensive and defensive coordinators that I think is great for the game as a whole. And I don't know how much necessarily this specific example of a hip drop tackle could play into it, but again, it's just more things favoring the offense, which again, player safety is a very important thing. We saw once all these, big name quarterbacks got injured this season, not on this specific play, but we just saw with them being hurt, there's obviously a lot of controversy around some of the roughing the passer penalties. There's just a gray area where we do want to make sure that these players are actually in the game, because, one specific play where it's a stupid penalty versus, us not getting to watch a Patrick Mahomes type player in the playoffs because he suffered a dirty hit in the pocket. And a lot of the times, some of these flags are ridiculous and they're not dirty at all. But just as sort of a talking point, the fact that we have seen the injuries of quarterbacks really hinder the seasons as a whole, the quality of the NFL. And I'm just curious to see how this is going to continue to progress. Really, the one other big story that's come out so far, at least as of the taping of this show, is the NFL just passed something to allow a third challenge to come into place. And what leap do you think Jalen Milroe will have this year? That's an interesting question. I do think that I'll finish off on this one quick thought on the challenges, and then I'll get into that. For the challenges, because I have it up on my phone here, where a team will be permitted a third challenge if it is successful on at least one or both of its challenges. It's another very big conversation in the league, and we see it a lot in basketball, is the reviews and how long that all of these different replays that take away from the game itself, and it can be just a very slow process and takes away from the game itself. I understand that they want to get everything right, but it is interesting in terms of the flow of the game. Sometimes it can be very agonizing to watch, specifically in basketball. I feel like that is the case. We're going to finish off here on the thoughts on Jalen Milroe. I think Milroe is very interesting because we saw the way that he went from being benched to being able to come back into the starting lineup and be the player he was down the stretch of the season. He is such a prototypical college quarterback in my eyes, where he has all the physical tools, and what I was really impressed with, it was really funny to see with Alabama last year that when Milroe was sort of putting up some of his biggest numbers, it was, he was using his legs as well. The offensive line that started out miserable during the year, they sort of started to get themselves going. But I mean, the arm of Milroe is just so talented on the deep balls that it is really impressive. And this is without necessarily a truly dominant wide receiver, as we've seen the wide receiver rooms in Alabama be completely stacked in years past, and Milroe was just able last year to, let it loose and pick up these big plays where it was either completing the pass himself or drawing flags down the field. And I do think that he can be somebody who, sort of as a developmental project, it's a little bit the more underneath stuff, the outside the numbers, that type of accuracy I don't think is fully there just yet. As you mentioned, being on the Falcons' radar, it's interesting because that would ideally be in the coming seasons. I don't believe he's draft eligible this year, but he plays a very different style of football than Kirk Cousins obviously does, which makes it a little bit hard to sort of game plan in a way that would benefit both Kirk Cousins and Milroe. And if you're a believer in Milroe over Kirk Cousins, I'm not the biggest Kirk Cousins guy. They just spent as much money as they did on Cousins. Now, they have an out after 2 or 3 years, so it's not like they are attached to him for the next half decade or anything, but I do feel like that's a little bit of a weird fit between Milroe and the Falcons. But I mean, I think there are a handful of teams. I feel like the Eagles could be a team that I could see Milroe going to, in the fact that, he and Hurts both have the running ability, they have the good offensive line, and they have the deep threats in Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. I know that there have been some A.J. Brown trade rumors. I can't imagine he's going anywhere, but some of the stuff between A.J. Brown and Jalen Hurts this season was a bit strange, and they have the option in Devontae Smith, who, either way, I mean, he is a burner of a receiver, and he could be a little bit of an Alabama connection there still, too. I don't know. I feel like that could be a pretty interesting fit. Curious how the Alabama's going to be able to perform this year without Saban. They brought in the Washington coach. It's DeBoer, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that they brought in DeBoer. I'm going to double check that. Kalen DeBoer. So, Washington's offense last year was incredibly fun to watch. That was another situation where I thought that they had a very quarterback-friendly system. They had the weapons on the outside, obviously, in Polk and in Rome Odunze, but I think that he can bring a lot of that same talent to Alabama. Curious to see how he's going to utilize that. Seahawks are a very interesting fit as well, because they also have a guy in Sam Howell who I also think has sort of similar arm talent to Milroe, weirdly enough, where Milroe's, bigger built and everything than Howell, but they're both athletic, can both move around. Some of the decision-making isn't always tremendous, and some of the underneath stuff isn't always, flawless, but both have pretty good arms down the field as well. And I could definitely see the Seahawks, where they don't have necessarily a defined option going forward, to, see how it progresses from here. It sounds like McDonald is set on Geno for the upcoming season. They like having Sam Howell in the building, but he's supposed to be the backup quarterback. I'm sure they will evaluate him there, evaluate Geno going forward, but I feel like he is probably on his way out of the Seattle starting job in the coming years. So Milroe, timeline-wise, could add up there as well. Wonder how high Milroe is going to go in a draft. The quarterback class as a whole next year is not as well-renowned as this year's draft, so could definitely see Milroe sort of working his way because of his physical tools being able to find their way into the first round, and as one of the top quarterbacks in next year's draft, if the season goes well for him, we'll answer this final question here. We do have to get off soon because the GSMC Baseball Podcast will be starting very shortly. But as far as the Warriors, I don't know how much there is for them to do. They have such a high payroll that they don't have a ton of flexibility for this year. They get to cut ties with Chris Paul after this season at least to offload some of that. But they're going to continue to ride out the situation with Curry. They'll be able to likely restructure a deal with Clay as he's an expiring free agent, probably get him for cheaper. But they have so much money tied up in Draymond Green and Andrew Wiggins, and I like the value that Draymond brings to the team, but I really do struggle to feel like there were other teams out there that were willing to give him over $25 million a year, especially when I know the Pistons were one of the teams in talks for him, and the Trailblazers were another, and that just never really made much sense to me why either of those teams would pay $25 million for Draymond, who's a good player. But the Kings might have been in on the talk as well. I actually feel like that might have been a better fit than these other teams, but now they just have all of this wrapped up, and these players long term, that there's not a ton of flexibility. We talked about Wiggins last week and the contract situation that he's on. You're going to have to give up assets to go along with that. Now, whether the Warriors are willing to part ways with their young talent or not, the way that they've been able to develop the guys they have over the past few years at least gives them the option to potentially, trade some of them off to try and make a big time offer alongside Andrew Wiggins. It's just a big time question of what is there going to be that they can necessarily make that work. Getting Clay on a cheaper deal would be very helpful for that situation, because they would be able to, as it currently stands with Clay, he's making a lot of money for the level of production that he's giving, and obviously it made sense when they gave him the contract at the time, but he is currently making $43 million against the cap, which is a ton of money to give up. So they get that restructured, probably have to find a way to make a deal with Wiggins. Talked last week about the potential of them trying to make an upgrade at the center position. Could definitely help them. But again, with these young pieces, and of course having Steph Curry, who's been dealing with some of these health issues with the ankle that he suffered against the Bulls a few weeks ago, that obviously doesn't help. But they do have a handful of different options, but I don't know if there is necessarily a right answer. I don't think we're going to get that right answer until we sort of see how the playoffs shake out. Not that I expect the Warriors to be a part of it, but again, the Cavaliers are a team that I'm definitely looking at in terms of if they fall short again, maybe trying to make a play for Jarrett Allen and try and add up some size to this roster. Such a shame that James Wiseman didn't work out for them, because you see some of the flashes. He still has so much athleticism, and he's been getting a little bit more playing time with the Pistons as of late. The consistency was never there with him. The IQ stuff definitely faltered during his tenure there with the Warriors, but you can see at least glimpses of why he was drafted as high as he was sometimes when he plays these games. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe to keep up with the show. We will be back here tomorrow at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, and we will see you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.